I think we've seen three things. The first is certain technologies have been proven, so to speak, in conventional warfare. So, unmanned systems, for example, drones were something that obviously had been used in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but they had been primarily in counterterrorism, counterinsurgency. Ukraine, we saw them prove to be impactful, powerful in a major scale conflict. And that's not just for the larger size versions, like, for example, the one supplied by Turkey, but also smaller civilian systems. The second thing that's happened is the war has just created a massive demand for supplies and munitions that most of the military is not just there, but the nations that are supplying them, like in the United States, even in Iran, have struggled to keep up with. So, for example, the Russians are literally running out of not only missiles, but even artillery shells. The third thing that's interesting is that some people have argued that there are certain technologies that have been proven to be less than useful, the tank or the warship, because they didn't do well in the opening weeks of the conflict. But I think that's exaggerated. It's not that the tank is done in war or that we won't see naval battles anymore. It's more that Russia bluntly used them in a very dumb way. And so that part of the argument about what it's meant for the global supply chain of conflict, that part isn't going to play true. We're going to see tanks still being sold, warships still being sold. Oh, every nation is looking at the war in Ukraine as almost like a classroom or a lab for them, where they're learning lessons about what works and what doesn't work, and everything from weapon systems, how you use them, how you organize, etc. So, for example, this use of unmanned systems, of drones and conventional warfare in these major battles. It's led every other military to look at this and say, hold it, we need to reevaluate how we're using these systems. Should we buy more of them? But also, how do we defend against them? You're going to see a huge increase in what they call counter UAS, counter drone technology. There's also the type of training that you provide. One of the lessons that a number of nations, including China, for example, looked at how well Ukraine performed and how poorly Russia performed. And a lot of that has to do with not just their organization, but the training in particular, not of their officers, but of their sergeants. And so that's leading to changes as well. I think both are happening. On one hand, there was almost a fear of Russia, or certainly a deep respect about what they might do in Europe, that drove a lot of defense planning in the United States. And it turned out the Russians, frankly, were not as good as everyone thought. And that was, reflected in everything from U.S. deployments to Europe to what people expected to play out in Ukraine. That said, people in the United States military know that the adversary that they're more worried about, China, is studying what's going on in Russia and won't make the same mistakes. There's also a question about the types of systems that we've had gaps in that have proven to be really useful in Ukraine. Examples, again, include not just large-scale drones, but these smaller-sized drones being used in swarms. That's something that the United States really hasn't deployed itself, but the Ukrainians and now the Russians have deployed them to pretty powerful effect. And so that's driven a lot of thinking about how might the U.S. military use them, but also how would it defend against these being used against its own units. Oh, certainly. And I think this is very much driven by the rise of China as not just an economic, political, but also military, truly superpower. It's going to be one of the most important stories of the 21st century in terms of geopolitics as to not only what does China do with this greater power? What influence does it seek, not just in Asia, but as it has a growing presence everywhere from the Middle East to Africa to Latin America? But also, how do other nations respond to it? Do we see other nations seeking to balance it and line up in opposition, perceiving China as a greater threat? Or do they, what we call bandwagoning? Do they seek to join it? Or is China able to draw them in either through inducements or threats? That's very much the power dynamic that's shaking up things. Again, not just in Asia, but we see that in discussions of what happens next in the Middle East. I think you hit that exactly right. These are alliances that are transactional, and they're also more about shared opposition than shared ideology or shared values. Whether you're looking at the relationship between a Russia and Iran, or even a Russia and China. What's changed in the last year is the position of power in that relationship. So, for example, between Russia and Iran's moved into a greater position of power relative to Russia. It's the one now supplying Russia with weapon systems that Russia needs, in particular, missiles and drones. The same thing with China. Putin had seen himself as a equal, as a partner, and yet now it's very clear that he's the lesser in the relationship. He's the little brother, and we've seen that in both ways that are very visible, how he was treated at international summits, but also in ways that China has handled Russia behind the scenes, turning the screws on it in terms of everything from what it's been willing to supply, what it's not been willing to supply, to even the prices at which it would buy energy from Russia. So China has been aligned, but it's also been willing to take advantage of the situation, so to speak.